I was standing at my wife's grave when my phone rang. It had been 6 months since we buried Dorothy, and I still visited her every Sunday morning. I would bring a small bunch of white daisies, her favorite. Not roses, never roses. She always said roses were for people who wanted to be seen, and I would stand there long enough to feel like I had said everything I needed to say, even when I had nothing to say at all. That Sunday was cold. November in Ohio has a way of getting into your bones that no coat ever fully stops. And I was thinking about driving home and making a pot of coffee when the phone buzzed in my coat pocket. It was Roy. Roy Hutchins had done plumbing work for us for almost 20 years. He was a quiet man, mid-50s, always showed up exactly when he said he would, never overcharged, never left a mess. I trusted him the way you trust someone who has been in your home dozens of times and never once given you a reason to doubt them. I had called him the week before about a slow drain in the downstairs bathroom, and he had said he would come by Sunday afternoon. I answered on the second ring. "Mr. Harold," he said. His voice was strange, not panicked. Roy was not a man who panicked, but careful, measured in a way that felt deliberate, like he was choosing every word before he spoke it. "I need you to come home. I found something down here under the crawl space, and I don't think you should see it alone." He paused. "Is Ethan available? Can you bring your son with you?" I asked him what he had found. He said, "I think Dorothy left this for you." I need to explain something about my family before I tell you what happened next, because none of what came after makes sense without the context of who we all were to each other. Dorothy and I had been married for 41 years. We met in Cincinnati when I was 24 and working my first job as a structural engineer, and she was teaching second grade at an elementary school 3 blocks from my office. She was the kind of woman who noticed things, small things, the kind most people walk past. She noticed when a cashier at the grocery store looked tired. She noticed when the neighbor's dog hadn't barked in 3 days. She noticed things about people long before those things became obvious to anyone else. We had 2 sons. Derek was the older one, 42 now, worked in commercial real estate in Columbus. He had always been sharp with money, always understood how assets worked, how leverage worked, how to look at a property and see not what it was but what it could become. I was proud of him for a long time. He had married Sandra 11 years ago, and Sandra was, I want to be careful here, because I am not a man who speaks ill of people lightly. Sandra was a woman who never entered a room without calculating what was in it that she could use. Ethan was the younger one, 38, an electrician, lived about 40 minutes away in Dayton. He called me every few days. He was at the hospital every day during the last weeks of Dorothy's illness. He slept in the waiting room chair twice when the nights were bad. He is, without question, the better man of the two. And I say that knowing full well what it sounds like for a father to say about his own children. Dorothy had been diagnosed with a rare autoimmune condition 14 months before she died. The doctors said it was progressive, that there was no reversing it, only slowing it. She handled the news the way she handled most hard things, quietly, practically, and without asking anyone to feel sorry for her. She organized her affairs. She updated her will. She had conversations with me that I did not fully understand the weight of until much later. In the last 4 months of her life, Derek and Sandra came around more than they had in years. At the time, I told myself it was because they wanted to be present, that the illness had reminded them of what mattered. Sandra brought meals sometimes. Derek sat with his mother and talked about the house, about finances, about what we had built over the years. I thought he was preparing himself emotionally. I was wrong about that. Dorothy died on a Tuesday in April. Ethan held her hand. I held her other hand. Derek was in the hallway on his phone. I drove home from the cemetery as fast as I safely could. I called Ethan on the way, told him Roy had found something, told him to meet me at the house. He asked me if I was all right. I told him I honestly did not know. Roy was standing in the kitchen when I walked in, still in his work clothes, a flashlight in one hand. He shook my hand, and then shook Ethan's hand when my son arrived 10 minutes later. He led us through the laundry room, past the water heater, to the crawl space access panel in the floor. He had moved the panel and set up a work light down below. I was following the drain line, Roy said. This section of pipe goes back further than it should. I started clearing debris to trace it, and I found a wall that doesn't match the foundation. like it was added later. There's a door in it. I told him the house was built in 1987. I had bought it in 1994. I had lived in it for 30 years and never known about a door. Roy climbed down first, then me, then Ethan. The crawl space was taller than I expected, almost 5 feet at its peak. Roy's work light illuminated a concrete wall that did indeed look different from the rest of the foundation. Slightly smoother, the mortar lines more precise. Set into, it was a heavy wooden door, maybe 4 feet tall, with a simple bolt latch. A padlock hung through the latch, closed. But beside the padlock, taped to the door at eye level, was a small white envelope. My name was written on it in Dorothy's handwriting. Ethan made a sound beside me. Not a word, just a sound. I stood there for a long moment. My hands were shaking. I want to be honest about that they were shaking. And I am not a man who shakes easily. I am 68 years old and I spent 35 years in structural engineering, and I have stood on unfinished bridges in high wind and kept steady. But seeing my wife's handwriting on an envelope taped to a door in the crawl space of my own house, 6 months after burying her, that undid something in me. I peeled the envelope from the door carefully. Inside was a small brass key and a single index card. In Dorothy's neat, schoolteacher printing, it said, "Harold, I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I couldn't be sure, and I didn't want to be wrong. Everything you need is inside. Read the blue folder first. I love you more than I ever said out loud. D." The room on the other side of that door was about 8 feet by 10 feet. It had been finished at some point, a bare bulb overhead on a pull chain, a folding table against one wall, 2 plastic storage bins stacked in the corner, and on the table, arranged in neat rows, a series of manila folders, a small combination safe roughly the size of a shoebox, and a yellow legal pad covered in Dorothy's handwriting. The blue folder was right in front. I pulled a stool from under the table. Dorothy had left a stool. She had thought of everything, and I sat down and opened it. What I found inside took me a long time to process, and I do not mean that loosely. Ethan stood beside me and read over my shoulder, and at one point he walked to the far corner of that little room and stood with his back to me for a while, because he needed a moment that I could not interrupt. Dorothy had been keeping records. The blue folder contained printed bank statements, not our joint account, but a secondary account I had not known existed, in her name alone. Over the course of 8 months, beginning 14 months before her death, right around the time of her diagnosis, someone had been making transfers out of our joint investment account. Small amounts at first, 2,000 here, 3,000 there, then larger ones. The total, across 31 transactions, was just over $219,000. The transfers had all gone to an LLC I did not recognize. Behind the bank statements was a printout from the Ohio Secretary of State's Business Registry. The LLC was registered to a holding company. The holding company, one step further in the paper trail, Dorothy had followed with a teacher's careful patience, listed 2 principals. Derek's name was one of them. Sandra's was the other. There was a sticky note in Dorothy's handwriting on the back of that page. It said, "I found this in March." Derek left his laptop open in the kitchen. I was afraid of what he would do if he knew I knew. Ethan called a lawyer friend of his that afternoon. Not a family law attorney, a woman named Patricia, who handled financial fraud cases and had a reputation in Dayton for being, in Ethan's words, the kind of lawyer that other lawyers are afraid of. She drove to the house that same evening and spent 3 hours in that little room with us. When she came back upstairs, she sat at my kitchen table and she said, "Mr. Harold, this is significant. This is not a family disagreement. What's documented in that room is wire fraud, elder financial abuse, and possibly more, depending on what the safe contains." I had not opened the safe yet. Dorothy had written the combination on the back of the index card from the envelope. I had been, I don't have a better word for it, afraid of it. After Patricia said what she said, I went back down and opened it. Inside the safe was a small digital voice recorder, a USB drive, and a handwritten letter from Dorothy. The letter was 4 pages long. I am not going to read all of it to you. Some of it is private in a way I intend to keep private. But the part that is relevant to what happened next is this. Dorothy had become suspicious of Derek and Sandra about 6 weeks after her diagnosis. She had noticed small things, the way Sandra asked questions about the investment accounts, The way Derek had started using phrases like estate planning and protecting assets in ways that made her uncomfortable. She had started paying closer attention. She had found the transfers. She had traced the LLC. She had also, in the last 2 months of her life, suspected something else. Her medications, 2 of them, a steroid and an immune suppressant, required careful dosing. Too much of either could accelerate the deterioration of her condition significantly. She wrote that she had noticed her symptoms worsening faster than her doctors expected. She wrote that she had noticed Derek had offered to help organize her medications during one of his visits, and that after that visit, she had started keeping her medications locked in the small box she kept on her nightstand. She wrote that she did not know for certain. She wrote that she could not prove it. She wrote that she had not told me because she had been terrified of being wrong, of tearing the family apart over a suspicion that might be nothing. She wrote, "If you are reading this, I was probably not wrong." The voice recorder contained 11 short recordings, Dorothy narrating what she had found, what she suspected, dates and amounts and names, in the same clear voice she used when she read to her second graders. Evidence. A record. She had been building a case in the dark, alone, while she was dying, so that I would not be left without one. I had to sit down on the floor of that crawlspace and just breathe for a while. I did not call Derek that evening. Patricia had told me clearly, do not contact him. Do not let on. Do not change anything about your behavior until we have spoken to the right people. She said we would need to move carefully. Derek was not stupid. Sandra was not stupid. If they suspected I knew, things could become complicated in ways that would be harder to undo. I did exactly what Patricia told me. I went about my week. Derek called me on Wednesday to remind me about Thanksgiving, which was 3 weeks away, and I told him we would talk about it later. I kept my voice neutral. I told myself to think of it as standing on an unfinished bridge in high wind and keeping steady. What I did not know was that Derek and Sandra had already begun their next move. 11 days after I found the room, I received a certified letter from a law firm in Columbus. Derek and Sandra had filed a petition for a guardianship review, a legal action arguing that I was showing signs of cognitive decline and was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. The petition cited, among other things, my alleged failure to maintain the property and my poor financial decisions following Dorothy's death. The irony of that last part did not escape me. I called Ethan. Ethan drove to my house in 40 minutes. We called Patricia, together. Patricia said, "Good. They've moved first. That's going to make this easier." She explained that a guardianship petition creates legal proceedings, which means discovery, which means Derek and Sandra would have to answer questions under oath. It also meant we now had a legitimate legal framework in which to surface everything Dorothy had documented. She said, "They thought they were going on offense. They actually just handed us the arena." The next 2 weeks were the most exhausting of my life, in ways that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. There were meetings with Patricia. There were meetings with a forensic accountant she brought in to trace the money. There were conversations with the local county prosecutor's office, because Patricia had contacts there, and because what Dorothy had documented was criminal, not merely civil. There were conversations with Dorothy's oncologist, a kind and serious woman who, when I told her what we suspected about the medications, said she had always found the rate of Dorothy's decline unusually fast, and that she had noted it in the file, but had attributed it to the natural variability of the disease. She said she would cooperate with any investigation fully. I am going to be honest about what those weeks felt like. I am a 68-year-old man who had just buried his wife. I was already gutted. Learning what Derek and Sandra had done, what they may have done to Dorothy, did not make me a new kind of sad. It made me feel something more like cold, like the kind of cold that clears your head rather than clouding it. I think Dorothy would have understood that. She had found the same cold in herself, I think, alone in that room she built, cataloging evidence with a pull-chain light and the time she had left. I was not going to waste what she had given me. The guardianship hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in January. Derek and Sandra arrived with 2 attorneys. I arrived with Patricia, Ethan, and a forensic accountant named Gerald, who had a gift for explaining complex financial fraud in language that made it feel almost too simple. Derek's attorneys presented their case first. They talked about my age, about the property maintenance issues which amounted to a slow drain and a section of peeling paint on the garage, about 2 instances where I had apparently forgotten appointments. I should note that Derek had never confirmed were actually scheduled. Sandra sat beside Derek in a dark blazer and looked sympathetic in a way that must have required real effort. Then Patricia presented ours. She laid out the transfers first. Gerald walked the room through them with a chart that had been printed cleanly on 4 large pages. He explained the LLC structure. He explained how the money had flowed. He explained the dates relative to Dorothy's diagnosis and the progression of her illness. He was calm and precise, and he did not editorialize once because he did not need to. Then Patricia played 3 of Dorothy's recordings. Derek went very still when he heard his mother's voice. Sandra reached for her water glass and knocked it over. The hearing ended without a ruling because the judge halted proceedings and referred the matter to the county prosecutor. That referral had already been in motion, but the hearing made it formal and public. Derek and Sandra were arrested the following Friday morning. Derek was charged with wire fraud, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and 2 counts of elder financial abuse. Sandra faced the same charges, plus a separate count related to the medications the investigation had found, through Dorothy's medical records and the input of her oncologist, sufficient grounds to pursue a charge of reckless endangerment, causing serious physical harm. The $219,000, plus interest, was ordered frozen pending restitution proceedings. There are things that happened after that I could spend a long time explaining. The criminal proceedings stretched into the following year. Derek's attorneys tried several approaches that Patricia, each time, anticipated and countered. There was a week in March when Derek's side attempted to challenge the admissibility of Dorothy's recordings, and I spent 4 days in a particular kind of suspended dread waiting for the outcome. The recordings were admitted. Dorothy, who had spent 34 years teaching children how to organize their thoughts and present their ideas clearly, had documented everything in a way that was, legally speaking, as clean as it was devastating. Sandra eventually took a plea arrangement. Derek went to trial and was convicted on 3 of 5 counts. He was sentenced to 4 years, with the possibility of parole after 2. The restitution judgment was civil, not criminal, and collection would take time, but the freeze on the LLC assets covered most of it. I do not spend much time thinking about what Derek's life looks like now. That is not because I don't feel anything about it, I do. He is my son. That fact has not changed, even though almost everything about what I understood him to be has. I feel something about that which I don't have a clean word for. It isn't quite grief and it isn't quite anger. It sits somewhere between the two, and I expect it will be there for a long time. What I think about more is Dorothy. I think about her sitting in that little room she had carved out, or rather that she had discovered behind the access panel of a house built by someone else's hands, and deciding to make it into a record. She didn't know if she would have time to finish. She didn't know if I would ever find it. She taped the envelope to the door at a height she knew I would notice, because she had been watching me notice things for 41 years, and she knew my eyes. She wrote, "Bring your son," because she knew I would be steadier if Ethan was there. She wrote, "Read the blue folder first," because she was still a teacher, because she understood that a person receiving difficult information needs to be guided through it in the right order. She did all of that while she was dying. She did all of that so that I would not be left alone with a hole in the shape of her and no understanding of how it had been made. The prosecution brought up the medications at trial. The evidence was circumstantial in the legal sense. There was no direct proof that Sandra had tampered with anything. Only the documented access, the statistical anomaly of the decline rate, and Dorothy's own written suspicions. The reckless endangerment charge was reduced on appeal to a lesser count. That outcome is the one I carry the most unsteadily. Dorothy's oncologist told me, in a conversation after the trial, that even if the medications had been normal, the disease had been taking Dorothy. The timeline might have been different, she said, but perhaps not dramatically. I don't know what to do with that. I hold it the way you hold something heavy, not because you want to, but because putting it down hasn't been an option yet. Roy Hutchins came by in the spring, about 4 months after the trial ended. He came to do some work on the outdoor spigot that had cracked over the winter. Afterward, we sat on the back porch, and I made coffee, and we talked for a while. He asked me how I was doing. I told him honestly. He said, "I almost didn't call you that day. I thought maybe I was making something out of nothing. He looked at his coffee cup. But there was a name on the back of the door. On the inside, carved into the wood. I didn't mention it at the time, because you had enough to take in. I asked him what name. He said, Harold. Just that. Your name. I looked out at the backyard, which Dorothy had planted with hostas along the fence, because she said, hostas ask nothing from you, and gave back shade, and she appreciated that in a plant. They had come back that spring without any help from me, the way things do when someone has planted them carefully. She had carved my name on the inside of the door. She had built that room, or finished it, however she had found it. However she had made it her own, and she had put my name on the door so that whatever was inside would always be pointing toward me. A room in the dark, with one light, that had my name on it. I am not a sentimental man by nature. I built bridges for a living. I believe in load-bearing capacity and margin calculations, and what materials can hold without breaking. But sitting on that porch with Roy that spring afternoon, I thought about what it means to prepare something you may not live to see used. To build a foundation for someone else to stand on. To measure what they will need, and leave it in place before you go. Dorothy had been doing the work of caring for people her entire life. In a classroom, in this house, in the way she kept track of everyone around her. She had done it quietly, without requiring anyone to notice. And even in the last months of her life, when she had every reason to focus only on herself, she had been looking out for me, gathering, recording, sealing it with a small brass key, and a note that said the most important thing last, the way she always had. I love you more than I ever said out loud. I don't believe that, Dorothy. I believe you said it every time you noticed something, every time you paid attention. That is what love looks like in the long run, not the declarations, but the noticing. 41 years of you noticing things about the world around you, and I was part of that world, and you carried that all the way to the end. Ethan drives up most Sundays now. Sometimes he brings his kids, my grandchildren, who run loud circles through the house in a way that would have driven Dorothy halfway to distraction and all the way to delight. We have dinner, and we clean up, and sometimes we sit on the back porch, and I don't always say much, but I don't feel the need to. The hostas come back every spring. The crawl space has a new section of drain pipe that runs exactly where it's supposed to, and nothing else. The little room is still there. I haven't sealed it back up. I go down sometimes and sit on the stool at the folding table, and I turn the pull chain light on, and I just sit. It's the closest I know how to get, right now, to sitting in the same room as her. There are people in this world who look at aging parents and see a balance sheet. There are people who look at a marriage and see an asset to be distributed. There are people who love conditionally, transactionally, and who mistake the absence of confrontation for the absence of consequences. I want anyone listening to understand something that I did not fully understand until I was standing in a crawl space holding a key. Integrity does not disappear when the person who had it dies. It waits. It stays in the places that person prepared for it, and it will find its way to the surface eventually in the hands of someone who knows how to hold it. Dorothy knew how to hold it. She held it her whole life. All she asked of me was to show up. I did. I always will.